Hello and welcome to the programme. The UN Secretary-General Ban Ki-moon was shaken but unhurt after a mortar landed near Baghdad's Green Zone while he was giving a press briefing. The blast happened minutes after Iraqi Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki had said the UN chief's visit was a sign that Iraq was on the road to stability. As Sebastian Walker now reports.
This is one of the subjects which I have discussed. And I will
the UN Secretary-General in his first visit to Baghdad, and it's not one he's likely to forget. The sound was from a rocket landing just 50 meters away. Iraqi Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki didn't flinch, and the press conference continued for a time. But with these pictures carried live on Iraq state television, it was a stunning reminder of how violence continues to plague Baghdad. Earlier, Ban Ki-moon had been speaking optimistically about improvements and expanding the UN's operation in Iraq.
However, recently, United Nations activities has been somewhat constrained, largely because of the situation on the ground. As we see the improved situation on the ground, I'm considering to increase the presence of the United Nations.
Minutes later, there were helicopters buzzing above the Green Zone where the UN chief is staying. And Iraq's violent drama continues to make international headlines. Sebastian Walker, Al Jazeera.
Well, our UN correspondent Mark Seddon says even though Ban Ki-moon was unhurt, the blast could have more far-reaching effects.
The Secretary-General made a surprise visit to Baghdad. There's speculation here that for a mortar to land in what is supposed to be the safest part of Baghdad, 50 meters away from the conference center, how tight, how secure was the information? Were there leaks happening? There's real concern about the safety of the Secretary-General and his staff. But, you know, this follows barely days after a high-level meeting here in New York to discuss the international compact for Iraq. As you were saying, the United Nations, Ban Ki-moon was saying too, steadily hoping to move back into that vacuum, a sort of 5-year security, economic and military plan for the country from the UN. This is going to make people feel very, very nervous and remind them of what happened back in 2003 when 22 UN staff, including the Secretary-General's own envoy, Sergio De Vello, was killed in a bomb attack in Baghdad.
A mass exodus is underway in Somalia's capital, Mogadishu. Hundreds of residents are fleeing the city after renewed fighting between government forces and suspected Islamic courts fighters left more than 60 people dead. Nadeem Barber has this report, and we advise that it contains some graphic images.
The latest violence in Mogadishu reportedly began when Ethiopian tanks guarding a Somali government base opened fire on unidentified attackers. The interim government blames the fighting, which has prompted hundreds of people to flee their homes, on remnants of the Islamic Courts Union, which was ousted last December.
The government's been attacked by the Islamic Courts terrorist network. They're working alongside Al-Qaeda after it announced their new head of operations, Aden Khashi Airo. He's now here in Mogadishu leading the fighting.
The Islamic courts deny launching the latest attacks, and analysts believe various militia groups are now driving the insurgency. This fighter says, "We're defending our honor, our religion and our country against the infidels and those who work with them. God willing, we'll defeat them." It follows a day of fierce clashes that killed at least 60 people and wounded dozens more, bringing back memories of the darkest days of the civil war. Fighters dragged the corpses of what appeared to be government soldiers through the streets before burning them. Sometimes residents joined in. Ethiopia insists none of its own troops died. The US has condemned the violence and insists Ethiopia's help is needed in Somalia.
Their intervention removed the Islamic courts from their attempt to seize power in the country and did pave the way for and again, we have to keep coming back to this point, for the legitimately chosen transitional federal institutions to assert their authority.
The interim government boldly announced it will pacify Mogadishu within 30 days, ahead of a reconciliation conference here. Meanwhile, the United Nations has put the number who've fled the city since February at 40,000, and it's rising all the time. Nadeem Barber, Al Jazeera.
There's been heavy gunfire in Congo's capital around the home of presidential runner-up Jean-Pierre Bemba. Witnesses say a group of armed fighters loyal to Bemba clashed with government troops in Kinshasa's administrative district. Last week, Bemba's supporters defied a government order to disband, saying they won't disarm until his security is assured. The exchange of fire was the first in the capital since the landmark elections in the Democratic Republic of Congo last year. Well, Jason Stearns, a political analyst with the International Crisis Group, says it's no surprise there's been fresh fighting.
Well, really the situation never changed much. In last August, after the announcement of the first round of presidential results, there were clashes through 3 or 4 days in Kinshasa. The reason for those clashes were that Kabila had a presidential guard of several thousand in Kinshasa. Bemba on his side also had a guard of 400 to 500 in Kinshasa. So neither of those guards were demobilized. So now that Kabila has been inaugurated as president, and Bemba still has his 400 to 500 guards, Kabila's saying, well, you need to demobilize your guards, I'm the democratically elected president. And Bemba, on the other hand, said, well, you tried to kill me last August. My security is not guaranteed without these guards. So the standoff is really still the same standoff as there was last August, and the negotiation efforts have failed.
US senators are turning up the heat on what has quickly become the latest political controversy to hit the White House. The Senate Judiciary Committee has joined the House of Representatives, and both are now threatening to force several of President Bush's closest aides to testify under oath. Democrats have rejected a White House plan to allow advisors to the president to be interviewed behind closed doors and off the record. But Mr. Bush says he's in no mood to give in. Well, our correspondent Kristen Salumi has been following the hearings.
President Bush has offered to make these aides available for private testimony with select congressmen and women, but off the record, not under oath, no transcripts available, and Democrats flatly refused that. The Republicans on the committee were suggesting perhaps that they would be open to some compromises, but the chairman of the Democratic chairman of the committee just wasn't having that.
Afghan government forces are reported to have killed 38 Taliban fighters in southern Afghanistan. That's according to a police official who said 2 separate attacks targeted hideouts in the Gurist district of Helmand province, the main drug-producing region of Afghanistan. But the Taliban has told Al Jazeera it lost only 4 men while inflicting heavy casualties on government troops. 28 people are still missing and feared dead after a massive landslide hit a remote village in Pakistani-controlled Kashmir. Dozens of army troops helped villagers dig through the rubble as the search continued in the snow-capped Himalayan region. Rescuers have already found 10 bodies in the rubble of 2 houses demolished by the landslide. Thousands of children and activists have marched through the Indian capital to protest against child trafficking. The 3-week-long rally travelled through several states in northern India and Nepal before ending up in Delhi. Joining the marchers were former child workers who had been traded as slaves across South Asia. They want the Indian government to pass a law to protect children's rights. In Nepal, hundreds of riot police are patrolling the streets of a border town after a fierce gun battle left 26 people dead. Former Maoist rebels and members of the ethnic Madesi group attacked each other after gathering in the same site for separate rallies and arguing over who had the right to use the spot. The government has imposed a curfew to avoid more violence. Now, until a few months ago, little was known about the Fatah Islam group in Lebanon. But last week, authorities accused the group of carrying out the February bus bombings that killed 3 people. Since then, the Lebanese army has imposed strict security measures around Nahia Bared, the Palestinian camp that houses the group. Its leader, Shakir Al-Absi, has been sentenced to death in absentia by Jordanian authorities, who claim he's linked to Al-Qaeda in Iraq. Al Jazeera's Zena Khoda spoke to Shakir Al-Absi.
They want to liberate pre-1967 Palestine. They support any group that confronts Israel. They reject American policies in the region.
We are in Nahia Bared, a Palestinian refugee camp in northern Lebanon. Behind this gate, the main headquarters of Fatah Islam. We came to meet the leader of this Salafist movement to find out more about this organization, which the Lebanese government accuses of being behind the bus bombings in February that killed 3 civilians.
Shakir Al-Absi leads this relatively new Islamic movement, which denies the accusation. Believed to have hundreds of armed followers, he refuses to disclose just how many. The Lebanese government says they are taking orders from the Syrian intelligence. Syria denies this and says an arrest warrant has been issued against Absi.
We are being accused of many things. They are not true.